He was King of England from 1509 until his death. Henry is best known for his 6 marriages and, in particular, his efforts to have his first marriage to Katherine of Aragon annulled. His disagreement with Pope Clement VII on the question of such an annulment led Henry to initiate the English Reformation, which meant separating the Church of England from papal authority. He appointed himself the supreme head of the Church of England and dissolved convents and monasteries, for which he was excommunicated. Resulting from his 6 marriages, Henry had several children. The best known are the 3 offspring who survived infancy and would succeed him as monarchs of England successively. These were Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. I will be looking at these in more detail later. His first 2 wives, Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, had several pregnancies that ended in stillbirth, miscarriage, or death in infancy. Henry acknowledged one illegitimate child, Henry Fitzroy, as his own, but is suspected to have fathered several illegitimate children by different mistresses. The number and identity of these is a matter of historical debate. There are many theories about whether Henry VIII had fertility difficulties. His last 3 wives, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard and Katherine Parr, are not known to have conceived by him, although Katherine Parr conceived in her next marriage. Let's start by taking a look at the children Henry conceived with his first wife, Katherine of Aragon. Katherine of Aragon was initially married to Henry's elder brother Arthur, who was the heir to the throne ahead of Henry. On the 14th of November 1501, Arthur married Katherine. They were married at Old St Paul's Cathedral. A dowry of 200,000 ducats had been agreed, and half was paid shortly after the marriage. Once married, Arthur was sent to Ludlow Castle, on the borders of Wales, to preside over the Council of Wales and the Marches, as was his duty as Prince of Wales, and his bride accompanied him. The couple stayed at Castle Lodge, Ludlow. A few months later they both became ill, possibly with the sweating sickness, which was sweeping the area. Arthur died on the 2nd of April 1502. 16-year-old Katherine recovered to find herself a widow. At this point, Henry VII faced the challenge of avoiding the obligation to return dowry, half of which he had not yet received, to her father, as required by her marriage contract should she return home. It was agreed that Katherine would marry Henry VII's second son, Henry, Duke of York, who was 5 years younger than she was. The marriage was delayed until Henry was old enough. Marriage to Arthur's brother depended on the Pope granting a dispensation, because canon law forbade a man to marry his brother's widow. Katherine testified that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated, as, also according to canon law, a marriage was not valid until consummated. Katherine's second wedding took place on the 11th of June 1509, 7 years after Prince Arthur's death. She married Henry VIII, who had only just acceded to the throne, in a private ceremony in the Church of the Observant Friars outside Greenwich Palace. She was 23 years of age. Katherine was pregnant 6 times altogether. In August 1509, 2 months after the wedding, Katherine's first pregnancy was announced. On the 31st of January 1510, she delivered a stillborn girl. In May 1510, 4 months after the loss of her first child, Katherine announced her second pregnancy. A son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, was born on the 1st of January 1511. In his honour, guns were fired from the Tower of London and the city bells were rung. Beacons were lit and free wine was distributed to all the population. 5 days after his birth, on the 6th of January 1511, the prince was christened at Richmond Palace. Henry VIII and his queen planned extravagant celebrations rivalling that of their joint coronation for the birth of his son, who automatically became Duke of Cornwall and heir apparent to the English throne, and was expected to become Prince of Wales, King of England, and third King of the House of Tudor. The tournament at Westminster was the most lavish of Henry's reign, and is recorded via a long illuminated vellum roll known as the Westminster Tournament Roll, to be found in the College Arms collection. Known as Little Prince Hal and the New Year's Boy, the prince was fondly regarded by Henry's court. However, on the 22nd of February 1511, the young prince died suddenly. The cause of his death was not recorded. However, an intestinal complaint is suspected. He received a state funeral at Westminster Abbey. It was another 2 years until the Queen again became pregnant. There is no known portrait of Prince Henry. Contemporary reports state that that both parents were distraught at the loss of their child. The deeply religious Catherine spent many hours kneeling on cold stone floors praying, to the worry of courtiers. Henry distracted himself from his grief by waging war against Louis XII of France, with his father-in-law Ferdinand II of Aragon. Historians have speculated what course English history might have taken had Henry, Duke of Cornwall, or any other son by Catherine survived. With the couple's failure to provide a live son, Henry VIII's desire for a male heir was the cited reason that led him to have their marriage annulled. A living son by Catherine might have forestalled, or even prevented the marriage to Anne Boleyn, and placed England in a different relationship with Roman Catholicism during the Protestant Reformation, thereby affecting and perhaps even preventing the English Reformation. By early 1513, Catherine was pregnant again. On the 30th of June 1513, Catherine was left as regent in England when Henry VIII went to fight in France. On the 17th of September 1513, she went into labour prematurely and gave birth to a boy who was either stillborn or died shortly after birth. In June 1514, Catherine announced her fourth pregnancy. In December 1514, she gave birth to a short-lived boy. In the summer of 1515, Catherine announced her fifth pregnancy. However, less hope was placed on an heir following her previous failed pregnancies. On the 18th of February 1516, Catherine delivered a healthy girl at 4 a.m. at Greenwich Palace, Kent. She was named Mary and christened 3 days later on the 21st of February with great ceremony at the Church of the Observant Friars. Despite his evident disappointment, Henry VIII said that if it were a girl this time, then surely boys would follow. Henry VIII's cousin once removed Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, stood sponsor for Mary's confirmation, which was held immediately after the baptism. In February 1518, Catherine announced her sixth and final pregnancy. In March, she visited Merton College, Oxford, and made a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Fryswide, asking for a healthy son. On the 10th of November 1518, she gave birth to a daughter at 8 months gestation, but the child was weak and lived only a few hours. Henry grew more intent on a second marriage. By 1527, he had convinced himself that Catherine had produced no male heir because their union was blighted in the eyes of God. Indeed, in marrying Catherine, his brother's wife, he had acted contrary to Leviticus 20:21, an impediment Henry now believed that the Pope never had the authority to dispense with. It was this argument Henry took to Pope Clement VII in 1527 in the hope of having his marriage to Catherine annulled. In going public, all hope of tempting Catherine to retire to a nunnery or otherwise stay quiet was lost. Catherine was banished from court, and her rooms were given to Anne Boleyn, Henry's love interest. Anne was an unusually educated and intelligent woman for her time, and was keenly absorbed and engaged with the ideas of the Protestant reformers. When Archbishop of Canterbury William Warham died, Anne's influence and the need to find a trustworthy supporter of the annulment had Thomas Cranmer appointed to the vacant position. This was approved by the Pope, unaware of the King's plans for the Church. In the winter of 1532, Henry met with Francis I at Calais and enlisted the support of the French king for his new marriage. Immediately upon returning to Dover in England, Henry, now 41, and Anne went through a secret wedding service. She soon became pregnant, and there was a second wedding service in London on the 25th of January 1533. On the 23rd of May 1533, Cranmer, sitting in judgment at a special court, convened at Dunstable Priory to rule on the validity of the king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, declared the marriage of Henry and Catherine null and void. 5 days later, on the 28th of May 1533, Cranmer declared the marriage of Henry and Anne to be valid. Catherine was formally stripped of her title as queen, becoming instead Princess Dowager, as the widow of Arthur. In her place, Anne was crowned Queen Consort on the 1st of June 1533. The Queen gave birth to a daughter slightly prematurely on the 7th of September 1533. The child was christened Elizabeth, in honour of Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth was born at Greenwich Palace and was named after her grandmothers Elizabeth of York and Elizabeth Howard. She was the second child of Henry VIII, born in wedlock to survive infancy. At birth, Elizabeth was the heir presumptive to the throne of England. Her older half-sister Mary had lost her position. She was baptised on the 10th of September 1533. A canopy was carried at the ceremony over the 3-day-old child. After a stillbirth or miscarriage as early as Christmas 1534, Henry was discussing with Cranmer and Cromwell the possibility of divorcing Anne without having to return to Catherine. Nothing came of the issue, as the royal couple reconciled and spent the summer of 1535 on progress. By October she was again pregnant. The Queen was aware of the dangers if she failed to give birth to a son. With Catherine dead, Henry would be free to marry without any taint of illegality. At this time, Henry began paying court to Jane Seymour. He gave her a locket with a miniature portrait of himself inside, and Jane, in the presence of Anne, began opening and shutting it. Anne responded by ripping off the locket with such force her fingers bled. Later that month, the king was unhorsed in a tournament and knocked unconscious for 2 hours. A worrying incident that Anne believed led to her miscarriage 5 days later. Another possible cause of the miscarriage was an incident in which, upon entering a room, Anne saw Jane Seymour sitting on Henry's lap and flew into a rage. Whatever the cause, Anne miscarried a baby, which, according to the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapoy, she had borne for about 3.5 months, and which seemed to be a male child. Chapoy commented, "She has miscarried of her saviour." In Chapoy's opinion, this loss was the beginning of the end of the royal marriage. Anne was executed by beheading on the 19th of May 1536 at the Tower of London. The charges against her included treason, adultery and incest. She was then buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Her skeleton was identified during renovations of the chapel in 1876 in the reign of Queen Victoria, and Anne's grave is now identified on the marble floor. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old when her mother was beheaded. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and deprived of her place in the royal succession, 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution. Next, Henry married Jane Seymour. By Christmas of 1536, Jane was pregnant, but subsequently lost the child. In January 1537, Jane conceived again. During her pregnancy, she developed a craving for quail, which Henry ordered for her from Calais and Flanders. During the summer, she took no public engagements and led a relatively quiet life, being attended by the royal physicians and the best midwives in the kingdom. She went into confinement in September 1537. Edward was born on the 12th of October 1537 in his mother's room inside Hampton Court Palace in Middlesex. Throughout the realm, the people greeted the birth of a male heir, whom we hungered for so long, with joy and relief. Queen Jane, appearing to recover quickly from the birth, sent out personally signed letters announcing the birth of a prince conceived in most lawful matrimony between my lord the King's Majesty and us. Edward was christened on the 15th of October with his half-sisters, the 21-year-old Lady Mary as godmother and 4-year-old Lady Elizabeth carrying the chrism. The Garter King of Arms proclaimed him as Duke of Cornwall and Earl of Chester. Jane's labour had been difficult, lasting 2 days and 3 nights, probably because the baby was not well positioned. After the christening, it became clear that she was seriously ill. She died on the 24th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace. Edward was the undisputed heir apparent to the throne. Henry's other marriages to Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard and Katherine Parr resulted in no further conceptions. Henry had many suspected illegitimate children, the results of many romances and mistresses. The only illegitimate child of Henry's which he formally acknowledged was Henry Fitzgerald. Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, was the son of King Henry VIII and his mistress Elizabeth Blount, and the only illegitimate offspring whom Henry acknowledged. He was named Fitzroy, which means son of the king. Henry Fitzroy was born in June 1519. His mother was Elizabeth Blount, Catherine of Aragon's lady-in-waiting. Fitzroy was conceived when Queen Catherine was approaching her last confinement. To avoid scandal, Blount was taken from the royal court to the Augustinian Priory of St Lawrence at Blackmore in Essex. Fitzroy's birth date is often given as 15th of June 1519, but the exact date is not known. His birth may have been earlier than predicted. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey was out of London from the 9th to the 18th of June when he reappeared back at court in Windsor. The following day he was expected to Hampton Court, but he did not reappear at a council meeting at Westminster until the 29th of June. The policy of discretion worked, as the baby boy's arrival caused no great stir, and diplomatic dispatches record nothing of Henry VIII's illegitimate son. The christening of the newborn Henry Fitzroy was not recorded, even though Cardinal Thomas Wolsey was his godfather, and known to have been present at the event. This puts the date of the christening possibly before the 29th of June, when he reappeared at court. The identity of the other godfather is unknown. The infant boy was given the surname Fitzroy to make sure that all knew he was son of the king. Henry VIII perhaps felt that his lack of a male heir was a slur upon his manhood. He certainly abandoned all discretion and openly acknowledged the boy. At one point he proudly exhibited his newborn son to the court. This could have taken place when the Queen threw a sumptuous banquet. Alternatively, Henry might have showed his son off at a banquet in the recently refurbished manor of Newell, in Essex. This would accommodate the myth that Henry had been revamping it for the use of one of his mistresses. Since his birth, Fitzroy had remained in the background. Such discretion over his son may not have been to the king's taste, and he may have felt his manhood and virality should be publicly vindicated. But he fully made up for his son's quiet birth and equally quiet christening when, on the 18th of June 1525, the 6-year-old boy was brought to Bridewell Palace on the western edge of the city of London, where honours were showered upon him. That morning of the 18th, the 6-year-old Lord Henry Fitzroy travelled by barge from Wolsey's mansion at Durham Place down the River Thames. At 9 a.m. his barge pulled up at the Watergate, and his party made their way through the palace to the king's lodgings on the south side of the second floor. During the first ceremony, when he was created Earl of Nottingham, 6-year-old Henry knelt before his father as Sir Thomas More read out the patents of nobility. It was the first time since the 12th century that an illegitimate son was raised to the peerage. However, the ceremony was not yet complete. Once again, young Henry Fitzroy knelt before his father, and as the patent was read, he was invested with the trappings of a duke. This time, when he rose to his feet, he was the Duke of Richmond and Somerset. When Henry VIII began the process of having his marriage to Katherine of Aragon annulled, it was suggested that Fitzroy marry his own half-sister Mary in order to prevent the annulment and strengthen Fitzroy's claim to the throne. Anxious to prevent the annulment and Henry's eventual break with the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope was even prepared to grant a special dispensation for their marriage. At age 14, on the 28th of November 1533, the Duke instead married Lady Mary Howard, the only daughter of Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. He was on excellent terms with his brother-in-law, the poet Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. The marriage was never consummated. At the time of Richmond's death, an act was going through Parliament which disinherited Henry's daughter Elizabeth as heir and permitted the king to designate his successor, whether legitimate or not. There is no evidence that Henry intended to proclaim Richmond his heir, but in theory the act would have permitted him to do so if he wished. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapoy wrote to Emperor Charles V on the 8th of July 1536 that Henry VIII had made a statute allowing him to nominate a successor, but thought the Duke of Richmond would not succeed to the throne by it, as he was consumptive and now diagnosed incurable. Henry died at St James's Palace on the 23rd of July 1536. His father outlived him by just over a decade and was succeeded by his legitimate son Edward VI, born shortly after Fitzroy's death. Most historians maintain that Edward, like Henry Fitzroy, died of tuberculosis. It is said that Henry Fitzroy might have been made king had Henry VIII died without a legitimate son. Well was it for them that Henry Fitzroy, his natural son, was dead. Otherwise, some suspect, had he survived King Edward VI, we might presently have heard of a King Henry IX. So great was his father's affection, and so unlimited his power to prefer him.